Here's what you can look forward to on this episode of The Nice Guys on Business.
But just in my years, the last 30 years of doing what I do, I've just watched our culture change into a very negative. They take the myths over truth. And so one of the myths is like, I'll never get rid of the hurt. And, if I continually say that over and over again, I'll never get rid of the hurt. I can actually make that a true statement. But I think you have to challenge the myths.
Get busy living or get busy dying. Or just listen to today's Nice Guys on Business podcast. Go from where you are now to where you could be. Get expert tips to grow your business, to be more productive and more efficient, whether you're trying to build influence, grow your community, or make it rain. Best-selling author of Nice Guys Finish First, Doug Sandler, can lead the way. The Nice Guys on Business is produced by Turnkey Podcast Productions. Now, here's your host, Doug Sandler.
Nice Guy community. So we are in for a treat today, but it's a treat of unexpected proportion. Our guest today is his name is Gary Howell, and he's a certified life coach. He's a family counselor, and he's a former pastor with 16 plus years of experience. He's also a father who lost 2 daughters. Gary has degrees in theology, sociology, and crisis counseling, and he specializes in motivational, inspirational relationship coaching, personal development, spiritual formation, and intervention. Here to talk about his international best-selling book titled A Little White Casket, Accepting the Grief and Loss of the Present, Confronting the Truth of the Past, and Reframing Towards the Future, is the author and good friend of the Nice Guys on Business, Gary Howell. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, man, I'm happy to have you here. And our friends over at Bestseller, before we connected, shared with me also, and you're living proof of the stuff that we're actually going to talk about. Not only did you lose 2 daughters, but you recently had a cancer diagnosis too. How's your health? And tell me a little bit about how you have actually, grown and expanded through this illness.
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the chapters that really in the book that talks about reframing. I'm having to live that in real time.
Mm-hmm.
It was about 2 weeks after I sent in my final manuscript. I kind of had a weird premonition. And then 2 weeks later, almost 3 weeks later, I was diagnosed with cancer. But that was back in February. So I'm doing really well. They think they got most of it. I'm on chemo 1 day every 3 weeks. So that's not a harsh regimen. And again, I'm having to put into action everything I'm asking people to do who read the book. So I'm living it in real time.
They say, you want to make God laugh, you tell him your plans. And what was your original plan when you started in your career? God forbid anybody ever has the experience that you have had, which, losing 2 daughters, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and then a cancer diagnosis. What was your original plan for your path?
Well, actually, at 15, I was going to be the center fielder for the Los Angeles Dodgers. That didn't work out. So I spent a lot of time in school. I'm one of those. I'm just a book nerd. I love to read, and then I kind of got into ministry in the pastoral role. Kind of backed into that, but it all based on the fact that I love people. I'm a people person. I love to help and serve, and that's why after going through my own pain, my counseling practice and coaching practice really took off because I have empathy gifts that I told my wife are going to kill me because sometimes I care more about the people's problems than they do. Mm-hmm. So where I'm at was definitely not a path or a pattern that I chose. It kind of chose me. And when I realized I need to just walk in it, that's when everything started to change for the good.
Tell me a little bit about the experience that you had of losing your daughters, and feel free to share. And I want to let you share the story uninterrupted. So I'm not going to interject too much, but I would love to know. Just tell me a little bit about how that helped not only shape your career but the experience itself.
Yeah, well, we were married maybe 2 years, almost 3, when we had our first daughter, and it was a rare disease at that time. Only 100 kids in the world had ever been diagnosed with it. So, and I think that was just because it was so new in the findings, but it was just all the normal stuff. She'd get a earache and the throats and all of that. And the doctor, finally one day, the doctor told us there's nothing wrong with this child except both of her parents are hypochondriacs. Needless to say, we changed doctors, but it was maybe a month after that, she was diagnosed with this. It's a rare, I could say the name, but it's a mile long. Really what it is, it's like AIDS, but it's not AIDS. It's like cancer, but it's not cancer. It's like leukemia. It attacks the immune system. And really, they don't die of the disease. They die of all the other things that happen when you don't have an immune system. So my wife was 8 months pregnant when my daughter died with my second daughter. And that, I mean, that was harsh in itself. You know, when my second daughter was born, my wife really didn't want her to come into the room. It was one of those things like I can't get attached to something else that might not be here.
Yeah.
So we worked at that. And then we had two daughters right after that. And you can imagine, I mean, I think anyone can imagine just the fear every time your daughter has a fever or is not feeling well, you automatically go right to worst case scenario. And that's what started the whole counseling thing. I can't do that. I can't survive this repeated worst case scenario stuff. So I really changed kind of the focus of my study into how the brain works and why we think the way we do and why do we respond. I mean, there's really certain clear-cut, brazen reasons why we do the things we do. And so once I started to figure that out, for me, it was easy to transcribe across the board to any of the people that I was counseling. So at that point, my wife, after two children, totally normal. Come to find out, then it was here's a reframing piece. So they told us it wasn't what's the word I'm looking for? Genetic. It wasn't genetic. So we had two more children. After the second one, they found out it was genetic. And I'm like, boy, if they would have told us that at the beginning, we may have not had other children to take the risk. So then we had our fourth daughter, thinking that this was in the past. And then I remember the phone call from my wife. She took my daughter to the doctor and said her name was Casey. Casey has the same disease Nikki did. And that was just a crushing blow. You know, it really was. Attacks your faith. It attacks. It demolishes everything that you held true. You know, that was a really dark night of the soul that night.
So take me back to your belief and your understanding that hope and healing is really possible after such intense grief, pain, and loss, especially of your second daughter, of the same thing that your first daughter had.
Yeah. Well, I learned that you can't change things you can't control, and it'd be easy to kind of fold up into a ball and just grieve. But have been my whole life a very positive person. If you say dark, I say light. I've always been that way. But it was hard to muster up any kind of positivity. And that's where, again, the crisis of faith, you either believe what you believe or you don't. And so I went from the premise that I do believe what I believed my whole life. And then I had to realize, I think the easiest way to get to where I wanted is I had to realize, why do you grieve and how do you grieve? What sets the tones? And I started to realize there's a lot of reasons we grieve certain ways. Your behavioral presuppositions, like if mom and dad were worriers, you're probably going to be a worrier. You know, the environment you grew up in, if you grew up in a positive environment, you handled grief different. If you grew up in a negative environment, you went right to negative. Your spiritual inclinations, whatever those were, whatever tribes you found yourself in, you kind of adhere to those. And so once I pinpointed why I handled grief, and by the way, there's a chapter, I think it's chapter 2 in there, where I talk about how my wife and I grieved polar opposite, not even close. And, your reaction is to kind of get angry for them not grieving like you grieve, and so we had to work through why we grieve the way we do, and then set a course for moving on. And I cover that in the book. Like, let's examine why you handle grief the way you do. So there's a lot of introspection in the first chapters of the book.
So it's interesting as you share some of the reality that hope and healing really are possible after this, and that people grieve in different ways. What are some of the myths that we have as a society, and is it specific to our culture? The myths about grieving. Yeah,
it's funny because I think I'm old and I'm 65 now. It's hard to say that out loud, but just in my years, the last 30 years of doing what I do, I've just watched our culture change into a very negative. They take the myths over truth, and so one of the myths is like, I'll never get rid of the hurt. And, if I continually say that over and over again, I'll never get rid of the hurt. I can actually make that a true statement. But if I think you have to challenge the myths. I have one chapter in there. It's called, it's challenging truths and myths. And you got to challenge those, because most of the time myths are incorrect or they're only partially true. So once you start to do that introspection, find out, that's not true. I don't always have to hurt. If I choose not to, a lot of it is mindset. I had one lady say, well, yours just sounds just a lot like uh, you're fooling yourself. And I'm like, I can understand you saying that, but it's not. I'm in control. I really am in control of my mindset. So myths, I don't even spend a whole lot of time on myths because I'd rather go to the truths that I spend more time. I usually say, listen, when I do a diagnostic on a client, I'm like, well, let's look at what you focus on more, because your choices you make determine how you feel about something, and what determines your choices are what you focus on. So do you focus more on what you have or what you don't have? Do you focus more on what you can control or what you can't? And do you focus more on the past or the present? And someone's response to that will pinpoint why they are where they are. If I'm only thinking about what I can't control, what I don't have, and I live in the past, I've set the stage to be hurt and to continue grieving.
What you're describing, is it a type of reframing, or is reframing a different have a different definition for you?
Oh, it does. That is incorporated in reframing, but probably simply defined, reframing is if I change the definition of something, I also change the feelings and the emotions that go with it. I was working with a client who was a pretty high up CEO at one of the major Intel firms, and he lost his job and he was almost suicidal. And I kept trying to teach him a reframing piece. About 3 months after we started work together, he got a job at another corporation at about, another 50 grand more a year than he was making at his job. He got laid off. So I said, now reframe it for me. He said, getting laid off was the best thing that ever happened to me. So he changed a bad situation that has bad connotations and bad emotions. And then you redefined it. And now it changes the way you think and the way you feel. So you can reframe really just about anything.
I think about the Wayne Dyer quote. What is it? If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. It really is
Absolutely.
Just a matter of how you're viewing it and what your perspective is. Talk to me a little bit about the 3D life-changing crossover course. I know that's a discovery, deconstruct, and develop. So maybe just share with me and our community what those Ds are really all about.
Yeah, I like to tell people you need to take the 3D course, and a 3D, when it comes to TV, it makes it crystal clear. It sets it apart and puts like TV in real time, and that's what we need to do. And so the first place, you can't do anything until you first discover, and that's that internal assessments you give yourself. Why am I feeling this way? Why do I act this way? Why do I choose this way? So once you discover your patterns, you have to deconstruct them. You have to really, I love watching like the home networks like Chip and Joanna and Fixer Uppers, and how they could, talk about reframing. They take a dilapidated house and they deconstruct it, and then they develop a new one, and it looks nothing like the former of itself. And so we could do that with ourselves. So I deconstruct all the negatives. Now, in my assessments, I find there's some positive things about me. I hold on to those. I deconstruct all the negative ones, and then I set a pattern, or I help my client set a pattern for developing those areas that we deconstruct. Because just because you get rid of something, nature itself hates a void. It'll always try to refill itself with the same thing you got rid of. So once you deconstruct, we better develop that area pretty quickly. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves back in the same place that we were. So it's really that simple. And people, you know what, I can tell who's interested, because it takes the discovery piece is the hardest part. Admitting some things about yourself, some things you didn't hold on to. I was just met with a client not too long ago, and I gave her a timeline, fill out a timeline of stuff that happened to you. And I've known her for 20 years, and she handed it to me, and I'm like, this is unacceptable. I could fill your timeline out better than you did. And she said something really I thought was profound. She goes, when I write it on paper, it becomes real. As long as it's in my head, it doesn't. And I'm like, yeah, that was really profound, but this is why she's trapped. She wouldn't do the hard work to discover these things that continually hold her down. So a lot of times, if I had to choose one of the Ds, I could only work with a client on one of the Ds, it would be the discovery. Because a lot of times when they discover their own things, they're pretty good about setting a pattern for themselves to change if they really don't like where they are. And that includes grief. That includes grief. My wife doesn't mind me sharing this, but I remember after our first daughter died, I remember coming home, and she'd be upstairs in the baby's bedroom, and and rocking in the chair and holding our daughter's, jammies. And I did my best, Jerry Seinfeld made her laugh and get her out of the room. Two things happened. One is I didn't allow her to grieve correctly, completely. I altered her grief, and she's going to take longer. And secondly, she said, I feel like if I don't do this would be a myth too. If I don't grieve like this every day, I'll forget her. Well, the chances of us forgetting her are zero, but that's the myth. You believe that. So when you get in and you take the myth apart and find out it's not true, again, then she took over from there. I didn't have to help her with deconstruct and develop. She understood that on her own.
When you started to write a Little White Casket, what are some of the things that you learned about yourself and maybe your own grieving process in the process?
Such a great question, because I thought I had it all dialed in, and that's because it's been a university course for me. In fact, I stopped a couple times along the way and said I wasn't going to finish it. I remember telling the people at Best-Selling Publishing are just amazing, every one of them. And I remember saying, really, this is what the world needs, one more book on grief and healing. And he said, look at the times we're in. We may need a book like this more than ever, which prompted me because I'm a people person. So I learned about myself. I was surprised how driven I was by fear. So if you're driven by fear, you can run away from fear all the time, but it never changes anything. And then I realized kind of my calling, that I'm here to help people. I love to serve people. I'm almost obsessed with watching people in pain and helping them move out of that. The problem is I meet some that aren't ready to move yet, and that's frustrating, for me. Mm-hmm. I learned about me that I also, in fact, not only am I driven by fear, but on the opposite end, that I'm a lot stronger than I thought I was. Because if you would have told me at 18, if you get married, you're going to lose 2 children, I wouldn't be married. I'd probably still be single, because I wouldn't call it cowardice, but no one calls pain and grief to come at you. It happens, Then people get addicted to the pain and grief, and it becomes their identity, their grief and their pain, and that sometimes they use that to meet a need in a negative way. Like, how can I get attention? I can either be a happy guy, or I could tell my sad grief story, and now people give me attention. That's a really negative way to meet certain needs. And we talk about that in one of the chapters. The needs you meet, either positive or negative, and that'll pinpoint where you are in life and why you do the things you do.
The book is called A Little White Casket: Accepting the Grief and Loss of the Present, Confronting the Truth of the Past, and Reframing Towards the Future. And I'll put a link in the show notes. It is available on Amazon. So take me through another path for just a second. I know that to reach a greater part of the population, it's great to have a book that's out there. But I also know you do individual counseling as well. So maybe just share a little bit about how your speaking, your counseling, your coaching programs work.
Okay. In fact, as soon as I get off here, I got to pack, because I'm speaking at a men's retreat Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I love that. I love the interaction. But the coaching is like, I used to do strictly counseling, and most counselors today, unless you're just a therapist, have changed from counseling to coaching. And I find that funny. Like, I would sit with someone, maybe if we were in a public place, and someone would come up and they'd introduce me as their counselor, kind of with a sheepish grin, which means I have a problem. When they introduce you as, oh, this is my coach, that sounds positive all the way around,
Mm-hmm.
So I call it, you're not supposed to mix the genres, but I call it coaching. What I do a little bit of counseling and coaching. And I do, it was hard for me. COVID was hard for me, because I love the one-on-one, the interaction. I love the person sitting right across from the table with me. And when I was forced to do it on Zoom for a year, that had a greater effect on me than I think it did the clients. Then I had to reframe that, realizing that, the whole world is on Zoom. Everything is telecommute. And so it was good for me. It stretched me again. But I do that, and I have a course I usually put people through. I'm in the process of putting some online courses together too,
Mm-hmm.
where I don't have to be there. They can click on and they can work themselves through that. That's coming soon to the website.
That's great. And I know that will be a great way for people to be able to connect with you. I'm really curious, Gary, if you weren't doing what you're doing right now and had the life experiences that you've had, what would you be doing? Because number one, you're such a positive person. And secondly, you just seem to have a really good cadence. Your personality lends itself to somebody to want to connect with you. What would you be doing, do you think?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I don't know what I would be doing, but I could probably answer that more by what I wouldn't be doing. I would not be sitting in a cubicle. I would not be driving a truck cross country, because I feed off of people. I feed off the energy. I love to see my energy transferred to them. Whatever I would do, it would have to be in the context of being with people, around people, involved with people. So, I mean, that could be a number of things. And so to me, the actual task of what I was doing wouldn't be as important as the avenue of which I took. I could sell hot dogs at a Diamondback game out here, as long, talking with people. I wouldn't make enough money to make my mortgage, I'm sure, but it would have to be in a public or a personal setting. So I can't really answer. That's a good question. I've had people ask me that before, and I've successfully once again dodged the answer because I don't know it.
Hey, we'll go back to the Diamondback thing for a second. I've heard some guys that are selling beer at the stadiums. They can make more in that 4-month period of time than they can doing anything else the rest of the year. So it could be a good career move for you.
That might be lucrative on the down points. Yeah.
Well, I so appreciate your message and your inspiration, Gary. Thanks for being on the Nice Guys today.
Oh, no, I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity, and I've enjoyed it.
Nice Guy community, never underestimate the power of nice. Again, special thanks to Gary Howell. All of his information, including access to his book and his coaching programs, will be right there in the show notes. Steve O'Brien, go ahead and take us out of here.
For the Nice Guys on Business, I'm Steve O'Brien. I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you meddling kids.